Good morning, everyone. We are going to be looking at Genesis chapter 24 for our time together. Now, Genesis chapter 24 is a rather lengthy chapter, 67 verses, in fact, and so we are not going to do all of those verses, or we're not going to read all of them right now. Instead, what I'll do is I'll read from verse 1 to verse 21, and then we're going to skip ahead to verse 58, and we will read a couple verses there, and then we will fast forward to the last verse in this chapter. So I encourage everyone to pull out their Bibles and follow along with me, and then when you get the time to fill in the gaps, because though we're not reading it, we're going to be utilizing those passages in our message today. So shall we get right into it? Genesis chapter 24, verse 1 through 21. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Abraham said to his servants, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all he had, put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but will go to my country and to my kindred and get a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all kinds of choice gifts from his master. And he set out and went to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water. It was toward evening, the time when women would go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. I am standing here by the spring of water, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. Let the girl to whom I shall say, please offer your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. Before he had finished speaking, there was Rebekah, who was born of Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, coming out with her water jar on her shoulder. The girl was very fair to look upon, a virgin whom no man had known. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, please let me sip a little water from your jar. Drink, my lord, she said, and quickly lowered her jar upon her and gave him a drink. When she finished giving him a drink, she said, I will water your camels also, until they have finished drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water. She drew for all his camels. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. Then, now picking up in verse 58. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will. So they sent her away, their sister, Rebekah, and her nurse along with Abraham's servant and his men. And then finally, the last verse of this chapter, verse 67. Then Isaac brought her into his mother's tent, into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So again, let me encourage everyone to please go back and read the full details. This is the longest chapter, partly because of a great length of repetition that occurs with Eleazar narrating the entire first half of the story again when he goes and meets with the family of Rebekah. But many scholars also point out that it's quite likely that though this was a normal pattern of storytelling in ancient times to be highly repetitive, it also conveys a significance to it. The fact that this narrative, this portion would be this lengthy makes us want to pay more attention to it and to really feel and go through the whole situation as if we were there ourselves. So to put this into context, remember in the previous chapter we found that Isaac's mother Sarah had passed away, and Abraham is left with just his one son. We're not counting Ishmael at this point, and he wants a wife for his son, and this is his great request. And so he called his servant, who in this chapter is unnamed, but we know from previous chapter he calls his name is Eleazar. And so he calls Eleazar and makes him swear an oath. Now, in any good story, there's a development of characters that happen. And the character that we find at the end of the story is oftentimes different than the character we knew at the beginning of the story, because the things that they go through, the experience that they go through, definitely changes them, and it leads them to a new place. And a cheap storytelling tactic that we've seen before, if you're reading a book or if you're watching a movie and you find characters moving along and there's this tension that builds up, and then finally at the end when you're expecting the climax and followed by the resolution of the story, you're then kind of let down because the author, maybe for their own reasons, say, oh, but this guy knew all along, and so he had anticipated everything and everything was settled. And it feels kind of like a letdown, partly because it doesn't employ a whole lot of creativity, but also, I think more importantly, because it doesn't really reflect life. No one knows how things are going to turn out before the fact. They only are able to step through the experience moment by moment. And you feel that tension in this chapter, a tension that seems to be building as we move along. We're not quite sure how it's going to turn out, but then, in the end, it does turn out well. Now, with this in mind, right, this entire story definitely has that progression within it, but this story is just one part of the grand story. And within the grand story of things, this entire part is all just the beginning of the story. And so you need to keep that in mind, because some of the things that you read about, or some of the things that you might pull out as lessons for yourselves, might not be the best lessons to pull away from, because there's still more to the story. And when you read the whole scripture, when you get to the New Testament times, and then you reflect back, you realize that, we need to be also people who understand that this part of the story is the beginning part, and they don't know what's going to happen. And so let's draw the right conclusions from it, and not assume that this is the end of the narrative in its totality. It's not. It's just setting up. So the entire Genesis, the Torah, the Old Testament, all of it is doing one thing in particular, which is building up to Christ, making us ready to receive the King. Now, having said that, keep that in your mind as we move into this. The very simple part of the narrative is just this: Isaac is growing up, and there's that age where you need to find someone. Every parent tells us about this and makes us unnecessarily nervous about it. So Isaac seems to be approaching this time in his life. Abraham wants him to have a wife, and sends Eleazar on a mission. What is the mission? Go to my home place and get a wife. The one restriction is, don't get someone from this place. That is, do not get a Canaanite woman for my son to marry. Now, why not a Canaanite woman? Well, part of it is just the obvious setting up of what we will find several times in the rest of Genesis, and then on into the rest of the Torah and rest of this Old Testament, even into the New Testament. There's this idea of, well, those people are all bad people, right? Canaan, if you recall, in the storyline that we've read earlier in Genesis, Canaan is associated with Ham, and so Canaan, the son of Ham, receives the curse that Noah issues upon Ham. It ends up falling on Canaan, and so you have that kind of a theological connection there. Later on in the scripture, we know that there is a common practice of do not marry the foreigners, and it's not because they're xenophobic, that they're against foreigners or strangers. It's because the foreigners don't have the same worldview or the same gods that we have. We have the one God. And so this was told and most clearly seen as a teaching moment that Solomon should have picked up on, because Solomon ends up going away from God. Very clearly the Bible says because of his wives and because of the religious practices that his wives bring into his household. Now, having said that, we know that Abraham's home place isn't all that great either. It's not just that the Canaanites were spiritually bad people, because couldn't there possibly have been one person in this entire place who feared God? We're not answering that question, because that question is not being asked. Instead, what's being said is go back. So let's try and figure out what is the important part of the going back that we need to be aware of. Oftentimes it's seen as, oh, go back because we need to marry within our own community, right? Maintain that ethnic purity that God has somehow bestowed upon us. But that's not, I think, what's being conveyed here. When you think about it, the argument that's used against the Canaanites, which is that they serve other gods, is the same argument that could be used for why you should not go back to your home place to find a wife for Isaac. Remember, God called Abraham out of that country and away from that lifestyle. Well, what was that lifestyle? It was serving other gods. Where do we get this from? Because this shouldn't be new to any of us. One, because the verse that I'm about to quote is very familiar to everyone, and two, because we've already talked about this. Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, right, very clearly tells us that Terah, as well as Abraham and his brother Nahor, they all served other gods when they lived beyond the river. So in the homeland, they were following idols, false gods. Joshua later on, when he gets to the point in Joshua chapter 24, the part that is very familiar to all of us, that choose this day whom you will serve. So what's the choice? Well, the choice is to choose to serve Yahweh, or to choose to serve the gods that Abraham and his forefather worshipped when they used to live beyond the river. So the idea is very clear that these are also pagan people. So it's not about religious purity. It's not even about ethnic purity, because later on we will find a very important character within this lineage who is married to someone who is outside of the Jewish ethnicity. And, that is an accepted fact of life. We have within the lineage of Jesus himself, we have characters who themselves are not Jews, right? And I'll leave it to you to go and find out those two women who are listed in the genealogy of Jesus, who are not Jewish. Even within our Marthoma Church liturgy, if you're very keenly paying attention, you'll notice the inclusion of interracial marriage as well as the silence on the matter. So in the marriage liturgy, we say that, may the God who blessed the God who blessed Adam and Eve bless you. May the God who blessed Abraham and Sarah, the God who blessed Isaac and Rebekah, the God who blessed Jacob and Rachel, the God who blessed Joseph and, I'll leave it to you to figure out who Joseph is married to. So we understand it and acknowledge it. It's for some reason still something that's not too talked about, but note that we're in the beginning of the story. Don't assume that we're getting taught certain things that we're not getting taught. God created all people in his image, not just one people group. And so there is nothing unbiblical about interracial marriage. Instead, what's being taught here is that there is a kind of criteria that Abraham is looking for in a future bride for his son. And we need to figure out what that characteristic is. And part of us wants to say that, it's, adherence to Yahweh. And we might feel like that we're on point because look, in Genesis chapter 24, verse 31, we get this insight into the character of Laban, and he is a real character that we'll hear more about later on in the story. So he calls out to Eleazar and says, "Come in, O blessed of Yahweh, of the Lord," right? Using the name of God, the name of the God that Abraham worshipped and followed, which is different than the God that they used to follow. So where did he get this from? Or, this seems like a good turning point, perhaps, in Laban's life, except if you carefully read the verse just before that, so verse 30. In verse 30, it says that Laban saw the ornaments that Rebekah was wearing, and that's what probably motivated him to then use whatever words needed to be used to make sure that this deal happens, because there's a lot to be benefited from when a rich person comes into town and wants to marry into your family. So later on, we know that Laban is not the nice guy that he makes himself out to be. We see it in this own text, in this own chapter, but then we'll see it later on when, man, he is such an unethical and sneaky guy who really cares only about himself. And moreover, he has idols set up in his home, idols that end up getting stolen, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So then what is really happening here? So if the Canaanites aren't that great because they don't serve the right God, if the people back home are just under, false pretenses and pretending to be following the right God, how are we supposed to understand the necessity for Abraham to find a wife for his son in this place? So on one level, there is a kind of building up of this concept of an idea of separation, right? There needs to be a difference that marks the people of the covenant from the people not of the covenant. And so this, this concept of being separated or being set apart, it comes from a Hebrew word, kadosh, which means to be holy. Holiness in its very literal sense just means to be set apart. God is holy, is holy, holy, right? If you hear the difference in how I spell those two words. He's completely holy, and that he's completely separated and just different from anything else in all of creation. And we're called to be holy too. So maybe this is a kind of holiness that we're looking for. The Jewish people definitely had this feeling of being set apart. They were specifically called, but different prophets and different characters, as we've already seen, like the character of Joseph, and different prophets have mentioned that, you know what, you're not the only group that God is calling and setting apart. Amos, and we've gone over this passage before, Amos chapter 9, verse 7 talks about how the Philistines are set apart, how the Cushites are set apart. We are told in the New Testament, when the new Gentile Christian converts came to faith, the Jewish Christians said, well, no, you need to be set apart like how we are set apart. You need to be Jewish and be marked with the same traditional markings as a Jewish man. And Paul said, no, that's not what sets us apart. That's not what distinguishes us from those around. So it seems to be a long-held idea that purity in marriage, or purity in a covenantal relationship, perhaps we could say, is equated to lineage or ethnicity. Some people still to this day feel like it's somehow correlated to economic status or prestige, but none of those things are the case. And it's understandable, maybe, that Abraham would conflate these two ideas of ethnicity and purity. Later, there would be several reminders, right, to maintain that ethnic purity. But when we carefully go through this passage, I think we'll see something, a quality in Rebekah that shows how this is nothing to do with ethnicity, and this has everything to do with authenticity. So when we carefully study this passage, we'll realize that the real criteria is not the external beauty that he noticed, or even the purity by which she has not known a man yet, right? Because later on you have the prophet Hosea, who marries a woman of ill repute, so a person who does not have the kind of purity that you would expect one to have, but nonetheless he creates a covenant with her, and that covenant is representative of the covenant that God has with us. Right? So it's not about external qualifications, but it's about an internal qualification. So we are looking into the heart of the character of Rebekah. She was someone who was hardworking. She is someone who is compassionate, but more importantly, she was someone who was willing to commit. Genesis chapter 24 is a love story, but unlike most love stories that we're used to, where romance precedes commitment, in this love story, commitment precedes romance. And so we see from Rebekah a trust, a willingness to step forward in faith and say yes. So whether the commitment be shown in a very physical, tangible way of committing to giving drink for 10 camels. Now, scholars say that from Hebron to roughly where Ur may have been in Mesopotamia, it would have been anywhere from 400 to 450, or maybe even more than 450 miles. It is a long journey. Camels can go for a long time without water, but when they do finally drink, they drink. And so it's not just going and pouring one jar of water into the trough and you're done. She would have had to go back and forth several times. She made a commitment, and just in that very simple action, she shows the authenticity of her commitment in not wavering until she made sure that every animal was satisfied before she moved on. And of course, now there's the stronger internalized commitment, which was to leave her family and to journey back 450 miles to where this supposed groom awaits her. So this journey would have been, months and months long. but boy, does it show a willingness to commit. Was there not, again, right, does that mean that there was no one else who could have committed to serving like this in the land of Canaan? Don't know. We're not sure. But why then, or one more reason do we understand, or can we pull out of this that teaches us about why Abraham decides to go back? Well, imagine life from Abraham's perspective now for a moment. Abraham was one who journeyed with God. He left his entire family to be where he is now. If I were to write a love letter and say to Roshan, I will cross the biggest street to get to you, it doesn't sound very committed. But if I say I will cross whatever ocean I need to get to you, that sounds like a bit more commitment. Going all the way back home, Abraham himself, knowing how difficult that journey was, him going back there was the best way to find someone who is willing to commit to the journey of life, to commit to going through that same kind of experience and hopefully getting to know the same God that Abraham knew. So it's a very profound and smart test to perform to find the right person for his son. He wanted someone like himself for his son. Now, not only is the intensity of her commitment seen in that she leaves her family and comes with this stranger to a new land, but more than that, there's a real problem going on in this family. Remember, Laban's not a super nice guy. And though everyone commits to saying, oh, this is of the Lord, a few verses later, in verse 55 to be specific, they say, that is Rebekah's mom and Laban, they say, well, let's wait just a little bit, 10 days maybe, and then we'll send her on her way. Now, the literal translation is for days and 10, which when you translate it literally, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so some people have just translated it as 10 days. But if it is a figure of speech, and one scholar points out that it probably refers to much more than just 10 days. Foreshadowing now the 14 years that Laban is going to put someone through in order to get married to another member of his family. You can imagine that this 10-day wait period was probably not going to be a 10-day wait period. And this is something that both of them seem to have schemed up to delay this commitment of Rebekah. Now, for some reason, maybe they thought they knew what Rebekah would say, they decide to call Rebekah. They call Rebekah and they ask, Rebekah, what do you say in this matter? And that's when you get to see the real commitment that Rebekah has, which is to say, I will, I do, I will go with this person back to his place. So she chose to go even against her own family's desires in order to fulfill what she felt God was calling her to do. This is not an easy decision, and in many ways, she parallels Abraham in that regard. What a great candidate for his son. Somehow, also, Abraham knew that this is only going to happen if it's voluntary. You can't force this woman to commit. And he tells Eliezer this much. But he has a trust. Abraham has this beautiful trust, even beyond the awareness that every person will make their own choices. He says this going back to verse 7 of chapter 24, that God would send his angel before you, and you shall find a wife. You shall find a wife. So Abraham was very much committed to knowing that the same God that called him, the same God that sent angels at the last minute to stop the sacrifice, that this God is really in control. He will take care of it. I just need to trust. You go, you'll find her. And fine, if she doesn't come, then you're free from this oath that I am making you take. But it's not going to come down to that. And I think he knew that it wouldn't come down to that. And so you find this strange, voluntary, and yet divinely orchestrated commitment of Rebekah. I hope that combination of strange voluntary commitment as well as divinely orchestrated commitment, I hope that sounds familiar to us. Because for those who are in Christ, each one of us would have gone through that kind of an experience. Now, as New Testament readers, there are so many nuances in this chapter. Again, read everything in light of Christ also. Eleazar was a friend of the groom. He was someone who went to go and prepare the bride, kind of almost like John the Baptist. He does work very hard, but he is a prayerful person. Though most of the story seems to involve him, don't forget for a second, the main character is the bride and the groom. And so how does this servant of God, this friend of the groom, how does he convince the bride? Well, look at verse 34. He tells the bride of the riches of his master's house. Right? He speaks of the promises that have been fulfilled. So in verse 34:6, in reference to the birth of Isaac, he witnesses and he gives testimony to the fact that God has done great things. Then he goes on to say of his own commitment to the mission that his master has entrusted him with. That is to go and call and invite the bride to come home, even though she has the option to refuse. So that's in verse 37. So Eleazar focused on bringing this bride home to the son. And in doing so, he kind of prepared a path. It's almost as if, he must decrease and the wishes of the son must increase. Remember, if this is all building up, perhaps we can see ourselves as an Eleazar type of character, where we are called to go out into the places and speak to people in such a way as to convince them there is one who loves them back home. There is one who longs to be in a relationship with them. Moreover, this name Eleazar, it means God is helper. In the New Testament, in the Gospel of John specifically, Jesus refers to the helper of God as the Holy Spirit, as the one sent by the Father into the world to convince the world who the Son is, that they would trust in him, that they would know the love of the Son. And so, in a very beautiful way, this is foreshadowing the work of the Holy Spirit in our own lives, calling us. Now, how wonderful and comforting it is to know that this long chapter is a chapter of the great journey that the servant would go to, that the helper would go to reach us and to speak to us. And it also tells us about the great patience of the son who waits, who does not force or coerce or drag the bride, but instead patiently waits. But it's not just a simple waiting, it is a costly waiting. I don't think you would have noticed it, but later on in the chapter, in verse 62, now Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi. This is not Hebron. The story began in Hebron with Abraham. And now we're starting to notice that there is another nuance happening in this chapter. What seems to have been just a simple, strong request is now likely to be a dying request that Abraham is making here. After Abraham's death, Isaac leaves that place and goes and resides in Beer Lahai Roi. And that's found in the very next chapter, in chapter 25, verse 11, you will see that Isaac settles there after the death of Abraham. it seems almost that through death, the bride is brought home and gets to experience the joy of finding the love of the son waiting. I can't imagine what it must have felt like from Abraham's perspective. And if you know Hebrew, you would have picked up on the way that the chapter began, because the way the chapter began is, and the Lord blessed Abraham. Now, there's no such thing as past tense or present tense in Hebrew. There's primarily completed action or incomplete action. When God gave the promise of blessings to Abraham, it was an incomplete action. It was something still yet to be fulfilled. But now in this chapter, it starts by saying, and God has completed the blessings. And so we also then are given a bit of insight into the fact that along this journey, somewhere along the way, Abraham would have died. And Isaac would have resettled. How patiently he must have waited. He could have gone for someone else, but he knew and he trusted that this helper would bring the bride home. And in this sense, there's one commentary that said that it could have been perhaps up to 3 years between the time of Eliezer leaving, or between the time of Sarah's death to the time where Isaac is remarried. In this time, he was patiently waiting. And he wasn't doing nothing, he was doing something. But this is part of the beginnings of this grand narrative that's being portrayed for us. And just in case anyone's wondering why then in the end of the verse it says, so Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Well, commentators are quick to point out that no wife could ever replace the life of a father in Isaac's life. But the woman figure in his life, Sarah, having a wife now helps fill that gap in his life. And so that's perhaps why it was written in this way. And also, just because I know someone is thinking it, well, in chapter 25, Abraham's alive and well. So if you remember back to Genesis chapter 10 and 11, you'll remember how we talked about how the events of those two chapters run parallel to each other. And that's the nature of storytelling. We can't always have storytelling in a linear format. Let's bring it home. What does this mean for you and for me? What does it mean to know that our Heavenly Father would long for his Son to be joined to the right bride, to the church, to make sure that the church is one willing to commit, to travel the distance with him, but does not leave it to chance, but sends the helper to go and make sure that it happens. Such is the case for each one of us. And if you've not known what true love is, when you commit first, then you will experience what love means. Because when you say yes to Christ and press into him, then you will know how much he loves you. And you'll understand the death that he had gone through personally to be able to show you his love for you. There's so many levels to this passage that ought to speak to us and comfort us during these times. So may the good Lord help it to reverberate in your heart in the way that it needs to, so that you would know one thing: Christ has come for you, and that you ought to be with him, that you ought to commit. So may the good Lord strengthen us and guide us in the days to come. Amen.